I suppose first question to start with, for those that are unaware, could you give a bit of background as to what cryptocurrency actually is and the kind of various guises and forms it takes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose in general sense, the way to think of it is it's any kind of asset secured on a blockchain. And it is worth just briefly saying what that is, which is in effect kind of like a digital ledger that records all transactions, and it can't be deleted, only added to. And each blockchain has a different way of defining how additions are made. So you can imagine just like you'd have an old accounts book with money in and money out. And why that's significant is because it's not held centrally by anyone, it's held everywhere, and in theory is unchangeable. So it provides a kind of a permanent record of who owns what. And by making entries into that blockchain, it can point to what those things are. And the most famous of those is Bitcoin, which has, it is both a blockchain and a cryptocurrency, which is a notional ownership of a thing which is secured on the blockchain. And because of that, people are prepared to imagine that it has worth and trade in it and monitor its price. But it could also be used for non-financial things like tracking logistics, drugs, through kind of like, say, pharmaceutical industry or patient records. But you'll also find it being a way of tracking things like NFTs and fan tokens, which are kind of related cryptocurrency type things you see cropping up in football. So in one sense, it's a thing that only has value because we imagine it does, but it sits upon a piece of technology that some people think has the ability, the potential to transform every area of the economy. In reality, the last 15 years since we've had them, no area of the economy seems to have been transformed. And you'll know in your own day-to-day life that you are not buying and selling things with Bitcoin. You're not using it to pay for coffees or anything like that. We've got to a stage where now primarily we see that cryptocurrency is a speculative asset used primarily by criminals and fraudsters and people looking to make a quick buck. But in theory, it is useful for a whole range of things beyond that. But right now, the focus is quite narrow.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. In terms of the relationship then between crypto and football, you mentioned fan tokens there, for example. What does that kind of history look like? How did that relationship first start, and what were the kind of driving forces between perhaps some of those organizations in taking up cryptocurrency?
Well, kind of crypto has been buzzing around sport for almost the best part of a decade. I mean, one of the lesser known kind of early adopters of crypto in football was Michael Owen, who launched his own Owen coin in I think it was about 2016 or 2017. And that kind of went nowhere because until about 2018, crypto was just bumping along. Bitcoin, it'd rise and fall, a few tens of thousands of dollars. Periodically, there'd be stories about, that guy in Wales who lost his thumb drive and allegedly it contains 300 million, 500 million, 700 million pounds worth of Bitcoin. But then from 2018, 2019, there was this big upsurge in the value of crypto. And then in early 2020, we had COVID. And so you had a lot of people at home. Many people were on furlough. So, a lot of people, obviously, COVID was an awful time for many people and very stressful. A certain number of people found themselves with more time on their hands and no great loss of income. And so you had this kind of perfect storm of factors. At the same time, gambling was kind of dropped away a little bit. And so you had this an entire industry that was still relatively young and relatively untarnished by scandal, and which was starting to create in a number of people's minds, though they will deny it now, the idea that you could create money out of nothing. And football, if you look at gambling or other things around the world, it's one of the foremost kind of recruitment and advertising tools. It's the one way that, especially the English Premier League, you can get your brand in front of literally billions of people around the world. And those businesses, the football clubs themselves, are desperate for cash. They cannot get enough in. As soon as it comes in, it goes out on wages and transfers. And so they are financially incentivized with very limited regulation of who they actually do business with to say yes to everything and not worry about if there were problems. And, in the early 2019, we saw Socios signing up some football clubs. We saw a number of clubs starting to get kind of cryptocurrency sponsors. And most of these clubs had no idea really what it was all about. But they smelt fresh cash and they said yes to it. And everything that happened after that was a consequence.
And then as to where we are in 2025, what do the range of different ways that the two interact look like? What does that landscape look like in terms of the various different types of tokens and how different football organizations are engaging with them?
So there was, post 2019, a big uptake, a rush in. A number of Premier League clubs and big clubs in Europe launched their fan tokens, which was notionally a way that you could engage with the club, but really just a disguised form of kind of speculation. You had others like, say, Whalefin or oh goodness me, what are they called? Binance, sorry, the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, Kraken and others who are paying to just advertise their exchange. So here's a place you can come and trade. And then still others, you had advertising their own cryptocurrencies. So Sheffield United, I think it's called Mannequin, has a cryptocurrency literally on the front of their shirt. So you're being encouraged to buy and trade cryptocurrencies of various kinds on the prospect of them going up in value, to invest in specific cryptocurrencies, and notionally then the owners of those will enrich themselves, or to buy into supposedly utility tokens or NFTs, which were marketed as some form of kind of digital memorabilia. So the range of engagements goes from things that are reasonably closely tied to the football clubs to general advertising. We saw there's kind of like a huge influx of sponsorship into 2021, 22, big crypto crash when you had FTX and other associated companies, and then Terra Luna, big exchanges and big projects turning out to be just massive frauds. And then at that point, kind of the funds drained away, and then gradually then there's been this slow kind of wind back up. So in 2022, a number of clubs had big sponsorship deals that entirely collapsed, leaving them tens of millions of pounds out of pocket. But as crypto's crept back into them, or at least Bitcoin has crept back up in value. And then we've seen recent years, kind of like an endorsement from the right in America, people believing that, there's still some peaks to come with that. We've seen some of those people coming back to football and again, encouraging the fans to trade in them and to put names on shirts. And so we're kind of, in terms of the total volume of sponsorship coming into football, I don't think we're anything like where we were 2 or 3 years ago before the crash. But we're at a place that's surprisingly large, given how terrible things were and how many billions of dollars of notional value were lost, how many NFTs and fan tokens were completely wiped out. And football is kind of, with this phenomenal ability to have a financially motivated short memory, is just pretending that nothing really happened and that fans should get involved again. So it's a cycle that goes round, and I imagine there'll be another crash soon, and you could have the same conversation in another 2 or 3 years.
Are there any clubs, you mentioned there, obviously Sheffield United, that were having a sponsorship? Are there any clubs that have taken that a step further? I'm thinking of Real Bedford or Crawley Town, for example, of ways in which the owners have tried to embrace and utilize crypto in different ways.
Yeah, I think Crawley Town is a really interesting story, because it shows the stark gap between the way they sell these things and the reality of it. So when they were first, appeared in the Washington Post and everywhere saying they were going to buy this English football club, they were going to take it to the Premier League, and everyone said, well, that sounds a bit unrealistic. And then it turns out it's Crawley, and Crawley is a wonderful community club, but no one who knows anything about Crawley, least of all the fans, would say there's any prospect of them going to the Premier League. And the way it was going to happen is that although they had this big collective of owners, no one owning more than about 5 or 10% until recently, some of those people were exceptionally wealthy, but many of the ones, including the most high profile, had come up through NFT sales and some crypto. And so were not people you would regard as classically football wealthy, wealthier than you and I, but not the kind of people that could, finance tens or hundreds of millions of pounds of losses a year. And their plan was to sell NFTs, which was their area of expertise, which would be used to finance the growth of the club, and would create a mechanism by which fans could engage with the club. So there was talk at the time that you would have a say on certain kind of aspects of how the club was run. You would have a kind of direct line into the board. There was even talk briefly that you would be allowed to vote for a specific team lineup that was going to be chosen for a cup game, which the owners very quickly realized they'd overstepped the mark there. But there was no specific defined way of doing this. It was all very much in their good graces, they will allow you to have your say on whatever you want to do. So you buy this NFT essentially with just a worthless promise that they may allow you to engage with it. And it was just at the height of the NFT boom, and possibly even slightly beyond it. But because they had some credibility within that field, they weren't a football club launching it so much as well-known people in the industry. They managed to sell about £4 or £5 million worth of these tokens, which is phenomenal and could be transformative for Crawley's finances. But the other side of that is you have people who know nothing about football now trying to run a football club, and they have made a series of mistakes, continually hired and fired people. They've done some strange recruitment based on their supposed belief in advanced kind of analytics. And truth be told, while they can on occasions they are nice people, they don't know what they're doing and they haven't learned. And since then, the market for NFTs has completely collapsed. Those Crawley NFTs are essentially worthless now. So everyone who bought them has lost everything on those. They're unsaleable. And any kind of meaningful engagement has effectively trickled away. So what you're left with really is some people from out of town who bought your club with a bunch of big promises. You've no idea how much money they have, and they don't seem to be learning as they go. So what did crypto actually bring to the party? Not really. It parted a lot of people with several hundreds of pounds, and the club is now in real danger of relegation again, and fans are deeply, deeply unhappy. So they just hadn't given any thought to how football and crypto could sit alongside each other if at all possible, and how you would create a structure that allows people to engage with the club. Football clubs require great expertise, and fan ownership is traditionally very separate from the running of the club for good reasons, at least in the successful clubs. So they just hadn't considered any of that, and now fans want them out. So it's interesting in that regard. You have other things like Socios, which have a much more limited kind of thing. They don't promise any kind of direct engagement with people who own your club, but they do say you would have a vote on very specific issues. Those issues have proved to be entirely pointless. And I think it seems pretty clear, as many people said at the time, that really what it was a the disguised recruitment scheme to get people to invest in crypto. So I don't think it's been a very happy kind of marriage between football and crypto in terms of bringing fans any closer to their clubs or meaningfully engage with them. It's just been a way of emptying people's wallets.
Yeah, I think that's probably my next question was going to be around fans tokens, and I was thinking of Socios and the digital collectibles, which have been presented as ways for fans to be able to engage and have a say in matters. And I was going to ask, how do they kind of stack up in practice? But I think perhaps you've answered that pretty well. I mean, are there any examples you could point to where there's been examples of success or satisfaction in terms of the level of engagement fans might get as a result of that?
Honestly, no, not at all. That doesn't exclude the possibility that there may not be somewhere. But I try to keep abreast of the situation. And in Crawley, you had NFT owners coming into their Discord channel and talking about what they wanted to do, and their enthusiasm vastly outweighed their understanding of football. And football fans of Crawley were like, well, who are these guys? Why are they telling me what we're going to do with my club? They don't know anything about it. They don't come to the games. You've seen universally across the Socios fan tokens, most other fan token competitors have since collapsed or gone away, is that there was a defined time of financial speculation where, for example, Manchester City's tokens peaked at about £25. They're now down at about £1.60. So every single fan token of a English Premier League club is below its launch price. So notionally, anyone who's bought anytime in the last 2 or 3 years has lost money. Most of the actual opportunity to engage through voting on stuff has got less and less frequent and less significant. I think one thing that I thought was most interesting is that Aston Villa, who signed with them, they changed their badge a couple of years, and when they decided to consult on what the new badge would look like, instead of actually putting this on Socios, which is the natural channel if this was genuinely an engagement activity, is they went to the season ticket holders, because for all their marketing says, they know deep down that there are gradations, there are levels of commitment, financial and emotional and community to a club, and that brings with it, mostly unrecognized, but in this case actually recognized, certain greater kind of voting rights. And they recognized that the appropriate way to do this, the proper way to do this, was to talk to their fan club and their season ticket holders. And we know beyond that Socios offers one free non-tradable token to every fan club member of each of their clubs. So in the case of Arsenal, there's about 200,000 registered fans. And last I saw, fewer than 10,000 had been claimed, whilst more than 5 million tokens are actually in circulation. So the number of people who could have one of these by virtue of their relationship to the club is tiny. And the vast majority of people buying these own multiple tokens elsewhere. So, and it's clearly just a kind of a trading game for them. So I don't rule out that there may have been some successes somewhere, but I find it very hard to find any, and any that look to me like it provides kind of a meaningful framework for future kind of engagement with football. Because I don't really think any of the businesses using football that way care about it or want that. And I think that if it did actually offer that, football clubs would run a million miles away, because the dirty truth really is that there are a small number of very good owners who do care what fans think. But genuinely, most of them really don't. They own their football clubs. That's their business. And the last thing they want is the great unwashed having their say on it. You only have to look at how clubs in the English Premier League manipulate or delay having real supporter engagement or a place on the board, how tightly they control those. The problem is not the lack of a technological solution that allows engagement and mass fan voting. It's the fact that those are not welcome in most cases from the owners.
So my question was sort of tied to what you were discussing there in terms of the Crawley fans and some of the resistance to the ownership and to some of the ideas they were trying to implement within the club. Have you seen examples of other clubs or different fans groups or organisations that have shown resistance to sort of the introduction of crypto into their clubs?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, for example, Leeds United fans were very unhappy about the fan tokens. Charlton fans were unhappy about the company signing up with an NFT provider, and specifically Crystal Palace fans, who have quite a reputation for being for monitoring and kind of disapproving loudly of tie-ups, also were very strong on Socios. They had displayed banners at their ground calling them morally bankrupt and parasites. Other clubs, like I recall at Manchester City, for example, there was really no whisper of protest, because at the time they were on, literally, I think when they were launched, it was like a 12-match unbeaten run. So I think that most of the time there's a very limited, strong engagement with commercial partnerships that clubs sign. And at most of the time, fans' attention is really focused on the performance of the club. And if the club is doing well, most stuff is really fine. They will let that slide. When there are problems or when things are not working out so well, then sometimes these deals can become a bit of a lightning rod for criticism. But I think, generally speaking, the majority of fans don't really care that much about the kind of financial partnerships their clubs are signing. And you can understand it. Why should they care? These things should, in my view, be properly regulated by an independent regulator, by leagues, by clubs themselves. And there's a limit that fans can do about any of this. And they know that more money coming in is more money they can spend on players. So it's been a failure, by the media and others to communicate the impact of some of this. And I think I always make the point with a lot of this that we tend to think that the people who lose money in crypto is kind of a few nerds at home who probably should have known better. But in reality, some of the biggest financial losses, some schemes in running into billions of dollars a year, the victims are usually in the global south. So Fulham had a partnership with a company called Titan Capital Markets, which I wrote about, and they were an entirely fictional organization. The person who was their CEO, who went to the football ground, signed the deal, shook hands, did video content, he's operating under a false identity. His senior staff are either all people from catalogs, they are models hired to appear in videos, or they are, again, people under false identities. And they were running a scheme all across Southeast Asia and West Africa, in church halls in Ghana, in hired offices in Thailand, convincing people that to invest with them using a back end where money is slurped in through stable coins and then vanishes. And they would say to them, crypto offers an opportunity for you who have very limited income to make a few dollars a day, which could be transformative for you. And you can trust it because Fulham, the oldest football club in London, have put their name to this. So as a result, scandals like that, one that Manchester City, one of their partners, was involved in, was a rolling crypto scam worth literally billions of dollars a year. All of that damage takes place outside of the eyes of UK fans. It's the loss of, a catastrophic loss of income. What for us, a few £100 is not the end of the world generally. A few £100, a few £1,000 for someone in Southeast Asia could be absolutely catastrophic. And so people have, the damage was done elsewhere. The money comes in and is spent in the UK. And so there's a disconnect there, and fans probably don't understand that. But coming back to the original point I was saying is that generally they don't really care, and why should they? Clubs now know. Clubs have no excuse. They know these schemes are brittle, prone to collapse, prone to fraud, and they're still doing it. And that, I think, is completely inexcusable.
You mentioned regulation earlier and the idea of an independent regulator. Is there any regulation in this space within football currently? And if so, how effective is it?
There's nothing specific to football. So as of late 2023, early 2024, the Financial Conduct Authority has had responsibility for governing the promotion of cryptocurrency in the UK. But what that really amounts to is if you are marketing it to people in the UK, you have to be registered with the FCA, and they will treat your advertisements as if they are high risk, volatile investments. But that's not the same as being a registered financial organization, of being a bank or a building society, where you have to have certain levels of capital reserves, certain reporting requirements. You can even have, there are third-party organizations who will provide your registration for you. So in effect, people whose identity we don't know can launch cryptocurrencies based around the world, target UK people or not, and you have no oversight of how they are operating. If it turns out through fraud or bad luck or bad management, all of your investment is wiped out, as it in most cases it will be. There will be no recourse for you. It's not like if you lose your life savings, there is, or your bank collapses, there are certain kind of governments and institutions that can make you whole. You won't be able to go, in most cases, to your credit card provider. So there is the tiniest amount of regulation, which is really but a fig leaf. Football itself has no interest in and no requirement to govern commercial partnerships. And the independent regulator, from what I can tell, will not have that power either. There's no desire from the government to start getting involved in monitoring those. So really, it's a voluntary system. There are some football clubs, even in the height of crypto, where they said, we don't want anything to do with that. We don't think that's appropriate for our fans. And great credit to them. But most of the time, these deals are done by, in effect, salespeople, and they have targets to meet. And if they don't do that, they're going to lose their job. And those targets are set by senior people in football clubs whose interest is solely in meeting their budgetary requirements. And given that, unless you can actually show clear evidence of kind of criminality or really, really disreputable behavior, most people are not going to look too hard. Often these deals come to them through third parties or kind of agencies who notionally do some of that due diligence. And so clubs have kind of complete plausible deniability. They can say, okay, it came to us through these people, they've done their due diligence, we've taken the money, and later on when it goes wrong, they'll just say, oh, we couldn't have known, no harm, no foul. So it's a situation of complete failure of regulation, where all of the incentives are designed to drive football to engage with people who, if not actual and knowing fraudsters, offer investment opportunities that are virtually indistinguishable from fraud.
I'd like to touch upon something earlier when we were talking about whether there were any good examples that you were aware of, or non-harmful examples you could think of. Do you think there could ever be a case or an example in which it could be used sensibly and ethically and responsibly, or do you think that that's just out with the realms of the two kind of ethos of crypto and football?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because it brings you to the point below crypto, which is back to the blockchain, which is what's that's value as a technology. And there's, I think the best way I've heard it expressed is that while in theory it can do almost anything, it doesn't do anything particularly well. So many of your listeners will be familiar with that, how slow Bitcoin can be to update, how energy intensive some blockchains are. And I've heard people describing it as, if you're using it in logistics, it's like using goodness, like a JCB to lift a 6-pack of beer onto your counter. Like it's massively over-engineered in some respects, and it's slow and not very kind of agile. And that most technical solutions, there are existing versions of those that work better and more flexibly. So if you're talking about it as a means of engaging with fans, you know, a lot of football clubs already have apps. They have email lists and contact details for their fans. They have social media. There are innumerable ways of them engaging with it. There are ways of them selling, if they desired, shares of the club to those people, which gives you a proper legal stake, a claim on something. And you have means of holding people on matters of varying importance, which, you know, all clubs and organizations or all companies already have ways of doing that, which are, you know, if they're good enough for general elections, they're good enough for checking what color people think next year's third strip should be. So at technological level, it's not clear to me that it does any of these things usefully. And going back to what I said at the very beginning, if you look at how in the areas in which in your life where it has actually made inroads, you know, people are very excited about AI and now also concerned about AI. And I am skeptical about a lot of things that people think it will do, but it is undeniable that it is immensely useful for some people in doing basic areas of coding. It's useful for document summarization. It's useful for drafting certain letters. It's not perfect. It's still, yeah, but already there are a lot of people who have seen how elements of that technology can change their productivity, can be used in their everyday life. And that just hasn't really happened. Your Bitcoin is not a new technology. It's 15 years old. Your blockchains have had that whole run and it hasn't really changed anything. So I'm immensely skeptical about that. And that skepticism about that technology generally has been kind of amplified by, if you look where we are now with the alignment of kind of Trump with his meme coins and others behind it, the kind of the way that the SEC in the US has let off the hook a number of ongoing fraud prosecutions, that there are some people who are genuine Bitcoin true believers who are horrified by what's going on, because they've always said that eventually all of the fraud, the misuse, the hype, the NFTs, the bad uses of it will fall away, and what you'll be left with is this kind of digital gold, this trustworthy thing that will take us into a new and that is being endlessly tarnished by, you know, it is quite apparent to anybody now that it is especially attractive to people engaged in money laundering and corrupt activity and fraud. And, you know, last year Binance were fined $4 billion, and you know, they have Ronaldo represents them, and they had their own fan tokens. And part of that plea deal showed that they had knowingly set aside anti-money laundering regulations, which had allowed named terrorist organizations to operate through their platform and launder money. You know, fine, as well as governments like North Korea. So I doubt the quality of the technology, and then the way it's being used. It's only finding a use in disreputable ways that I think should drive away most people who really care about their brand. And as I mentioned before, not only are fans not particularly interested, I've come to the conclusion over time that football clubs, despite what they say, they don't like bad publicity, but they don't really care about their brand, because over time we've seen football brands are incredibly resilient. If you are winning trophies, it doesn't matter who last year's front of shirt partner was. It's almost impossible to damage that connection and attraction. And so fans are brilliant at compartmentalizing those things. It's hard for me to think of a scandal big enough that crypto could be involved in that would actually make a football club regret having signed a deal. The only one that upsets them is occasionally they sign deals where they don't get to see the money because they didn't ask for it up front.
Yeah, blinded by the check. Yeah.
Exactly.
I suppose last question is really around what the future might look like between the two. And do you envisage this to be something that's going to stick around for the foreseeable, or do you think actually football's dabbled with crypto to very limited success and it will fade away? It's been a bit of a phase, bit of a fad to some extent. How do you see that future panning out?
It's a really interesting question. I think before the re-election of Trump, I had thought that it would be a series of kind of ever diminishing returns, peaks and troughs, but with lower peaks and deeper troughs as the kind of the speculative nature of it became clear. And as funds begin to dry up through kind of the trading apps, as there are fewer and fewer people engaged in the market, that necessarily produces fewer people who to target and less money for those advertising budgets. And I think that will continue to happen. I think that, in that sense, in a couple of years, we'll probably look back on this as some strange, bizarre period, and everyone will pretend it didn't happen. I think that the kind of the more unlikely but interesting possibility is there's been talk amongst certain crypto people that there, should be a US crypto reserve. The idea that the government would buy over time a series of an enormous number of Bitcoin, which would push that price up, and like I say, they would imagine it would be a digital version of Fort Knox. If that happens, and if they can persuade American pension funds or large organizations or investors to put some of their money into that, I think that creates the potential for enormous financial instability on a global level as well as in the American economy. What you're talking about there is effectively a giant fraud whereby the American public through the government agrees to act as a backstop for a massive amount of financial speculation. If the US, if they pass a regulations or laws to that effect, you'll see the price of Bitcoin absolutely rocket and money be poured into advertising everywhere, including in the UK and in football clubs. And at a certain point, everyone will take their profits, and that will collapse in a couple of years, and it will leave a hole in the US Treasury to the tune of tens, possibly hundreds of billions of dollars. That really concerns me. I'm not a macroeconomist, and I don't know how strongly to value that risk. Whatever happens, I'm convinced, and I have been wrong about many things before. And if people are looking for an alternate perspective on crypto and sport, there are certainly others available, and I would encourage those to seek them out. I still hold the view very strongly that in a few years' time, it will be a thing that you kind of all half remember. Hey, do you remember that time when they were sponsored by this, or they were sponsored? What was that all about? And everyone, like these terrible things of the past, will pretend that they were never involved in it. And no, I was never stupid. I always knew that was dumb. So that would be my view. But it's very hard to be certain about these things.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for your thoughts on that. Very interesting, and plenty of food for thought, I think, for the course.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.